Hi everyone, it's Kathy for Not Too Shabby Shop, and today I'll be sharing two clean and simple cards that came together fairly quickly using the Tea Time Buddies stamp set by Not Too Shabby. So in addition to the Tea Time Buddies, I'll be using the Cross Stitch Hearts background stamp from Whimsy Stamps, one of the stencils, which I can't remember the name of, and the Quick Strips dies, also from Whimsy Stamps. I'll have everything linked in the description box below, along with the coupon code for the Not Too Shabby Shop, so make sure to check that out. So the first thing that I did was I put a piece of cardstock on top of my cling-mounted rubber stamp, and I did put some temporary adhesive on the back of my cardstock so that when I flipped over my Misty tool that it would stick to the bottom of it, and then I knew that my cardstock would be lined up on the stamp right where I wanted it to be. I treated the cardstock with my anti-static powder bag because I'll be doing some heat embossing. I inked up the stamp using VersaMark Ink and stamped it down. I did stamp it twice just to make sure that I got good coverage, and then I coated the stamped image with detail white embossing powder. I used my heat gun and heat set that until it was melted and shiny. Then I brought in Be Mine ink from Catherine Pooler Designs and used a small ink blending brush and just added ink kind of in the bottom left-hand corner. And I wanted the ink to kind of fade out. So I concentrated it to be a little bit darker in the center because I know I was going to be covering that part with the image. But as I moved out towards the edges and towards the top, I wanted the ink to fade out a little bit so there was still a lot of white space on the front. I really like this technique when you do stamp and emboss a background stamp and do the ink blending like this, because you still get the texture from the embossing, but then you have something because of the ink blending for your eye to be drawn to. After I was done with the ink blending, I did use a dry paper towel just to buff off the embossing powder to remove some of the ink so that the embossing powder was bright white again. I set that panel aside and then started to work on my little teacups. Now, for my teacups, I wanted to bring the background into the foreground. So I stamped the teacups once onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock with Catherine Pooler Midnight ink. And I colored the top teacup just with one color, because the next thing that I'm going to do is put that back in my put it back into my Misty, and I'm going to ink up the same cross stitch hearts background stamp with Catherine Pooler's Mint to Be ink. Then I'm going to stamp right over that. So yes, I'll also be doing some paper piecing. After I stamped the background stamp on the first set of teacups, I stamped the teacups 2 more times, again on Cougar Super Smooth cardstock with the Catherine Pooler Midnight ink. Then I colored the handle on the bottom teacup with the same green marker that I used for the top teacup. Then I moved on to the middle teacup, which I colored in pink. I started out with RV55 and added that on the outer edges so that I could have a center highlight. Then I brought in RV23 and it was a little bit too light. I couldn't get the RV55 and the RV23 to blend. So I used the tip-to-tip method to blend those colors a little bit easier. And I did the same thing for the handle. I started with the RV55 and then used the tip-to-tip method to finish up the handle. After I was done coloring in the pink teacup, I set that aside and pulled in the one where I had stamped the background. I wanted to add a little bit of shading on the bottom teacup, so I used my cool gray markers for that. I wanted the bottom teacup to be primarily white with just the background stamp pattern on that one. Then I added a little bit of shading to the scallops on the top teacup and the pink teacup. For the shading on the scallops, I just used two cool gray markers, and then I blended that out with my colorless blender just to soften some of those harsher lines. For the tea, I started with E34 and I colored all of it in with E34, and then I brought in E35 just to add a little bit of shading on the outer edges as well as the splashes that are coming out of the cup. moving on to cutting up the pieces for my paper piecing. For the bottom teacup, I did cut that out, and I just cut out the cup part because I had colored the handle on the second time that I stamped the stamp. For the fussy cutting, I did cut right up to, if not a little bit, right on that stamped line, just so that when I did the paper piecing, they pieced together very, very cleanly. The other thing I did was I did go around the edges with a black marker just to clean up some of the not so perfectly cut areas. So for the top teacup, I was kind of debating on whether or not to leave the cross stitch pattern on the scallops for that top teacup, and it turns out that I really didn't want to do that. I thought it would be okay at first, but I ended up doing even more paper piecing, and I had colored in the tea a second time so that I could cut it out and then include the scallops so that the scallops would remain white. And on those scallops, I also used the cool gray markers just to add in a tiny little bit of shading. When doing fussy cutting, especially when you're trying to do something this small, one of the things that I really like to do is hold my scissors primarily straight and then turn the cardstock with my left hand. It helps with the cleaner cut, particularly around rounded edges like the scallops. I had run the originally stamped teacups through my Gemini Junior with an oval die. I used liquid glue to do all of the paper piecing, and once I had all those bits and pieces glued into place, I adhered that oval to a pink scalloped oval, and then it was pretty much time just to put the rest of the card together. The ink blended background with the emboss resist, I did cut that down to 4 by 5 1/4. And then I adhered that to a piece of pink cardstock that measures slightly larger, and then adhered that to the front of a top folding A2 size note card. I put foam tape on the back of the teacups and adhered those into place. I decided that I needed to add in the little tea bag because, well, they were teacups, so why not add the tea bag and then, the opportunity to use one more stamp that's in the set. Very simple coloring on the tea bag. I only added in the shadows with C3, C1, and my colorless blender to blend out the harsher lines. Then I used R55 to color in the heart. For the sentiment, I stamped that using VersaFine Onyx black ink onto a little scrap of pink cardstock that I had, and I ran that through my Gemini Junior with one of the quick strips dies. Once I had the sentiment die cut, I kind of played around with the placement of the sentiment. I had an idea that I did want to have that up at the top, and then I decided that the tea bag wasn't very prominent down by the teacups, so I thought maybe I could move that up by the sentiment. And I finally settled in on a place where to put that, so I used my liquid glue to adhere the tea bag to the sentiment strip. Then I used my fingernail just to make a little dent in the cardstock on the edge of that strip so that I would know where to cut off the excess. And then I used liquid glue to adhere that into place. To finish it up, I added a couple of the smallest rhinestone gems that I've had in my stash forever. And then I added some glossy accents to the top of the tea just to add a little bit of shine. And that finishes up my first card. Moving on to the second card. I basically did the same layout. The only thing that I changed up was the background. Instead of doing an emboss resist technique for the background, I just used a stencil instead. So I used some painter's tape to hold the stencil, to hold my cardstock to the stencil. And then I used an ink blending brush with All That Jazz ink, also from Catherine Pooler. And again, concentrated so that it would be a little bit darker in the center of that stenciled area, and then I fade it out towards the edges. For the macarons, I decided to go with green, blue, and purple. And for the coloring, I kept it really very simple, and these images are really very easy to color. Anyway, I started with my darkest color on the outer edges of the cookie and then blended towards the center. I did leave a center highlight just so that they would appear to be more round. And I did the same technique for all 3 of the cookies. I was planning on putting this card together the same way that I had put the first card together. but my die shifted when I ran it through my Gemini Junior, so I had to do a little bit of an adjustment there. Anyway, I had cut the stenciled panel down to 4 by 5 1/4 and adhered that to a piece of turquoise cardstock that's just slightly larger, and adhered that to the front of a top folding A2 size note card. So as I had mentioned, I had a little bit of a mishap with the die shifting when I ran the macarons through with my oval die. So what I did was I just die cut another plain white oval and I fussy cut the macarons. I adhered the white oval to a turquoise scalloped oval, and then I added foam tape to the back side of the cookies and adhered that in place. For the sentiment for this card, I played around with the placement on that forever. I couldn't figure out where I wanted it, but I knew that I wanted to use one of the fishtail banner dies. Luckily, the sentiment that I used is itty bitty teeny tiny, so I was able to just stamp the sentiment again and cut off the other end and then adhere it to the front of the card where I wanted it to go. And for final touches on this card, I used more of those super tiny little rhinestone stickers and added those up around the sentiment strip. And then I decided to add some, what are those little white round candies that you put on, like, they're not sprinkles, but they're the round ones. I can't remember what they're called. Anyway, to get that look on the cookies, I just used a white gel pen for that, and that finishes up my second card. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.